Imagine for a moment that you are a creature who has spent every single day of your existence walking on solid ground. Your entire understanding of reality is built on a few unshakable truths. Trees grow upward, rivers flow downhill, and water is the single most precious substance in the universe because it keeps you alive. You have spent generations, millennia even, learning the precise locations of every freshwater stream, every hidden spring, every muddy puddle that appears after rain. Your brain, your culture, your very survival depends on this knowledge. Then one day, perhaps chasing a wounded antelope or simply following the migration of birds that seem to know something you do not, you climb over a ridge of sand that feels wrong beneath your feet, too loose, too shifting, and suddenly the world ends. Not with a cliff, not with a mountain range, but with an infinite, roaring, liquid horizon that stretches so far into the distance that your eyes cannot find the other side. The sound alone is like nothing you have ever heard, a constant, thunderous exhalation that drowns out every familiar noise of the forest. The air tastes different, metallic and strange, and the wind coming off this impossible expanse carries a cold that seeps into your bones in a way no winter wind ever has. You approach cautiously because your entire life has taught you that water means survival, that finding water is the victory cry of your species, and you kneel down to drink from what should be the greatest freshwater source your tribe has ever discovered, and it burns. It burns your throat with a chemical fury that sends you reeling backward, coughing, gagging, your eyes watering with betrayal. You have found an ocean of poison. You have reached the edge of the known world, and the edge is trying to kill you. This was not a single moment in human history, but rather thousands of moments, spread across tens of thousands of years, as our ancestors slowly migrated out of the African interior and stumbled upon the coastlines of the ancient world. Each tribe, each family group, each wandering individual experienced their own private apocalypse at the water's edge, and the psychological trauma of that discovery cannot be overstated. We are talking about a species that had, by this point, mastered fire, developed complex stone tools, and hunted megafauna across savannas and forests. We were the apex predators of the terrestrial world, and then we walked into something that made us feel like infants again, like prey, like fools who had misunderstood the most basic rules of existence. The ocean was not merely a new environment, it was a reality glitch, a fundamental violation of everything our ancestors thought they knew about how the world worked. Water was supposed to be inside the banks of a river, contained and manageable, something you could walk around or wade through. This new thing had no banks. It had no edges. It was a liquid desert, an endless expanse of hostile territory that moved on its own, that rose up and crashed down with a violence no storm on land could match. And worst of all, it was completely and utterly undrinkable. To the prehistoric mind, this must have felt like discovering that the sky was made of stone or that fire had begun to flow like water. It was supernatural in the most literal sense, beyond the natural order as they understood it. The saltwater problem alone would have been enough to break the minds of early coastal explorers. Think about the desperation of thirst, that creeping, maddening need for water that has driven humans to drink their own urine, to squeeze moisture from elephant dung, to kill each other over muddy seeps and desert rocks. Now imagine feeling that desperation while standing next to more water than your brain can even conceptualize. Water as far as the eye can see, water that sparkles in the sunlight and laps at your feet with almost seductive gentleness, water that is completely and lethally useless to you. It is the ultimate cosmic prank, a torture device designed by a universe with a particularly dark sense of humor. Early humans must have tried everything to make this water drinkable. They must have dug holes in the sand hoping the earth would filter out the poison, must have boiled it over fires expecting the salt to burn away like smoke, must have mixed it with fresh water from inland hoping to dilute the curse. And every single attempt would have failed, because the ocean does not negotiate. The ocean does not care about your thirst. The ocean is a billion-year-old chemical machine that operates on scales of time and volume that make human concerns look like brief, warm flickers. To stand on that beach parched and desperate, surrounded by more water than exists in every river and lake you have ever known combined, and to know that drinking it will only accelerate your death, must have been an existential horror that we can barely reconstruct today. It would be like a modern astronaut landing on an alien moon, finding an atmosphere that looks breathable, taking a deep lungful, and discovering it is pure chlorine gas. Everything about the appearance says life, and everything about the chemistry says death. But the cruelty did not end with the undrinkable water. The coastline was a minefield of deceptive survival traps that must have killed countless early humans before they learned to read its patterns. Freshwater estuaries, those magical mixing zones where rivers met the sea, were the only reliable sources of drinking water for miles in either direction, but they were hidden, tucked behind dunes or mangrove thickets, often brackish and unpredictable. A tribe that settled too close to the open ocean without finding an estuary would find themselves in a nightmare scenario, surrounded by food sources they could not yet access, next to water they could not drink, watching their children weaken from dehydration while the mocking surf roared just meters away. And then there was the matter of the ground itself, the very sand beneath their feet, which transformed from solid to liquid with each incoming wave. Inland humans knew how to read terrain, to identify stable ground for sleeping, to find caves and overhangs for shelter. The beach offered none of this stability. The tide came in and erased your footprints, swallowed your fire pits, turned your campsite into a drowning pool. The psychological impact of watching the land itself disappear beneath your feet, regularly and relentlessly, must have been profound. On land, if the water rose, it meant a flood, a storm, a temporary disaster. On the coast, the water rose because an invisible force in the sky commanded it to do so, and it rose with mechanical precision twice every single day, regardless of weather, regardless of season, a clockwork catastrophe that made a mockery of human agency. The tides were, in many ways, more terrifying than the salt water itself, because they represented a type of danger that early humans had absolutely no framework for understanding. Inland rivers changed with the rain, with the seasons, with meltwater from distant mountains. These were causes and effects that a clever observer could learn to predict. But the ocean pulled back for hours, exposing strange creatures and glistening rocks and what looked like safe passage to new territories. And then it surged forward with accumulated fury, drowning anyone who had wandered out onto the exposed seabed, smashing against cliffs with a force that shattered stone. And it did this not randomly, not in response to storms, but on a schedule so precise that it would eventually be measurable, yet so alien that it must have seemed like the breathing of a sleeping god. The moon, that pale nighttime companion that inland humans had noticed but never depended upon, suddenly became the master of life and death for coastal tribes. The connection between that distant silver disk and the crushing weight of billions of tons of shifting water was not just non-obvious, it was actively counterintuitive. How could something so far away, so seemingly gentle and remote, command the very earth to disappear beneath your feet? Early coastal humans must have developed elaborate mythologies to explain this relationship. Stories of lunar deities who pulled the waters with invisible ropes, of angry sea spirits who demanded regular sacrifices of territory, of a cosmic war between the sky and the land fought with liquid weapons. The truth that the moon's gravity was literally lifting the ocean's surface toward itself would have sounded no less absurd to them than their myths sound to us. The important thing is that they learned to fear the rhythm, to memorize the timing, to build their lives around the retreat and advance of an enemy that never slept and never stopped. And yet, against all this terror and confusion and existential bewilderment, something extraordinary began to happen. Because humans, for all our fear and superstition, are also the most stubbornly opportunistic species that has ever existed. We are the creatures who looked at fire, that destructive force that consumed forests, and cooked our companions alive and decided we would domesticate it. We are the species that looked at wolves, those efficient killers that haunted our nightmares, and thought perhaps if we feed them, they will work for us instead. And so, slowly, painfully, over generations of trial and error that must have cost countless lives, our ancestors began to look at the ocean not just as a wall of poison, but as a pantry that required a very specific key. The coastal oasis theory suggests that during periods of drought and terrestrial scarcity, when the game animals thinned out and the inland water sources dried up, the survivors were often those bands of humans who had learned to stomach the beach, who had figured out that the ocean was not entirely hostile if you understood its rules. These were the people who learned to read the tide pools, to time their foraging with the retreating water, to smash open the armored creatures that clung to the rocks, and dig up the buried mollusks that tasted of nothing they had ever eaten before but filled their bellies with dense, sustaining protein. They were the ones who figured out that certain seaweeds were edible, that crabs could be cornered and cracked, that the strange, slippery things that darted through the shallows could sometimes be speared if your reflexes were fast enough and your patience deep enough. This dietary shift was not just a matter of survival, it was, quite literally, the fuel for the greatest cognitive upgrade in the history of our species. Here is where the story takes its most unexpected turn, where the ocean transforms from a villain into a protagonist, from a curse into a blessing so profound that it may have determined the entire trajectory of human evolution. The human brain is an absurdly expensive organ to maintain. It consumes roughly 20% of our body's energy budget, despite making up only about 2% of our body mass. To grow a bigger brain, which is exactly what our ancestors did over the past 2 million years, you need an enormous surplus of high-quality nutrients, particularly omega-3 fatty acids and iodine. These compounds are relatively scarce in terrestrial environments, but absurdly abundant in marine ecosystems. Shellfish are packed with DHA, the specific omega-3 fatty acid that makes up a significant portion of brain tissue. Seaweed and fish are rich in iodine, which is essential for thyroid function and neurological development. When our ancestors began regularly consuming coastal resources, they were essentially mainlining the chemical precursors of enhanced intelligence. It was as if the ocean, having terrified them with its poison water and devouring tides, was now offering them the exact molecules they needed to become smart enough to understand it. The irony is almost too perfect. The environment that seemed most alien and hostile was the one that held the keys to our mental kingdom. Bands of coastal humans did not just survive, they thrived, their children developing larger cranial capacities, their elders living longer and retaining more knowledge, their social structures growing more complex as they developed new technologies for harvesting marine resources. While their inland cousins struggled through dry seasons and competed with other predators for dwindling game, the beach people were eating seafood feasts and watching their brains expand. The archaeological evidence for this transformation is scattered along ancient coastlines that are now often underwater themselves, thanks to rising sea levels, but it is compelling where we can find it. Middens, those massive ancient garbage heaps of shells and bones, testify to the sheer volume of marine harvesting that was taking place tens of thousands of years ago. Tools specifically designed for fishing, for prying open oysters, for processing seaweed, appear in the record with increasing sophistication. And alongside these material remains, we find the skeletal evidence of bodies that were nourished differently, that grew taller, that lived longer, that carried the physical signatures of a diet rich in the building blocks of advanced cognition. The ocean did not just feed these people, it selected them. In the brutal logic of evolution, the humans who could best exploit coastal resources had more surviving offspring, and those offspring inherited both the physical adaptations and the cultural knowledge necessary to push further into this new frontier. Fear became familiarity, and familiarity became mastery. The tide that once drowned the careless became a clock that the careful could use, a predictable rhythm that scheduled their days and organized their societies. The salt water that once burned their throats became a resource they learned to navigate around, a boundary they mapped with increasing precision, finding the freshwater lenses in coastal aquifers, the springs that bubbled up through the sand, the streams that maintained their sweetness right up to the moment they kissed the sea. And then, in what may be the most audacious act of defiance in the entire animal kingdom, these coastal humans looked at the ocean and decided it was not a wall after all, it was a highway. The same species that had once cowered from the tide, that had watched the moon pull the water away and wondered what vengeful god was responsible, began to build things that floated. We do not know exactly what the first watercraft looked like because wood and reeds do not preserve well across 50,000 years, but we can make educated guesses based on the archaeological record and the behaviors of modern hunter-gatherers. Rafts of bundled reeds, perhaps, or hollowed-out logs, or simple frames of wood covered in animal hides. Whatever their form, these vessels represented a conceptual revolution that is difficult to overstate. A creature that had evolved for millions of years to walk on land, that had spent generations learning to fear the ocean as a boundary and a poison source, had now created a technology specifically designed to surrender itself to the water's embrace. The first human who pushed off from shore in a floating object must have experienced a terror that we can barely imagine. The primal panic of leaving behind the only environment that had ever supported life, committing themselves to a substance that had killed their ancestors, trusting that a bundle of plants or a hollowed trunk could protect them from the crushing indifference of the deep. And yet they did it, again and again. Across millennia, they pushed further, island hopping across Southeast Asia, crossing stretches of open water that no other primate had ever contemplated, reaching Australia when sea levels were lower, but the crossing was still a terrifying leap into the unknown. This was the moment when the ocean completed its transformation in the human mind. It ceased to be the edge of the world and became the path to new worlds. The fear did not disappear, of course. Sailors have always been superstitious, have always respected the sea's power, have always known that the same water that carried them to new shores could swallow them without a trace. But the relationship changed from one of pure terror to one of negotiated respect, of learned skill, of a partnership that was always unequal, but sometimes profitable. The humans who mastered the ocean gained access to territories that were unreachable to their competitors. They could escape drought by crossing to wetter islands. They could trade resources across distances that land-bound tribes could not imagine. They could fish in deeper waters, harvest from reefs that were inaccessible from shore, develop maritime cultures that stored their knowledge in navigational songs and star maps, and the subtle reading of currents and swells. The brain growth that had been fueled by coastal foraging was now being applied to maritime technology, to social organizations capable of crewing vessels, to linguistic systems complex enough to pass down navigational knowledge across generations. The ocean had forced us to become smarter, and now our enhanced intelligence was allowing us to colonize the ocean itself, to spread across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, to become the first species in the history of life on Earth to treat the entire planet, land and sea alike, as a single interconnected habitat. And so we arrive at the profound contradiction that defines our species' relationship with the ocean to this day. It is the place that terrified us, that broke our understanding of how the world worked, that poisoned us when we tried to drink it and drowned us when we tried to walk on it. It is also the place that fed the explosive growth of our brains, that taught us to read the sky and measure time, that served as the launch pad for our transformation from a terrestrial African ape into a global superorganism capable of crossing any barrier the planet could erect. When you stand on a beach today, if you have ever stood on a beach and felt that strange mixture of peace and unease, of awe and insignificance, you are experiencing something that connects you directly to the first humans who ever saw the ocean. The neurological wiring that produces that feeling was installed by ancestors who stood on similar shores 50,000, 100,000, perhaps even longer years ago, their hearts hammering with the same complex cocktail of terror and wonder. The ocean has not changed. The salt content is roughly the same. The tides still pulse to the same lunar rhythm. The horizon is still just as infinite and just as indifferent. What changed was us. We grew brains large enough and complex enough to hold both the fear and the fascination simultaneously, to be humbled by the ocean's power while being inspired by its possibilities. The first humans who reacted to the ocean did so with confusion and horror, and they were right to do so. They were encountering something that genuinely was, from their perspective, a supernatural boundary between the world they knew and an abyss they could not comprehend. But they did not retreat forever. They learned, they adapted, they evolved, and eventually they conquered not the ocean itself, which remains unconquerable, but their own fear of it. They turned the greatest threat they had ever faced into the greatest opportunity they had ever known. And that perhaps is the most human story there is. We do not survive by avoiding what frightens us. We survive by becoming smart enough, stubborn enough, and just barely crazy enough to make the frightening thing work in our favor. The ocean was the ultimate test of that strategy, and against all odds, we passed.